Welcome to the Scale the Chaos podcast, where we talk all things contributing to your business dysfunction. I'm your host, Rhonda Lee, a certified Six Sigma Black Belt dedicated to helping organizations break free from the chaos. In each episode, I bring on industry experts to share their insights, experiences, and practical advice on navigating the challenges of modern business. Today's episode is part one of my conversation with today's expert guest. Be sure to check out the second part of our conversation in the next Scale the Chaos podcast episode. Today's guest is Jodi Brown, a brain tumor survivor turned transformational leader who helps organizations reduce chaos through improved interactions and communication. As a professional speaker and author, Jodi brings unique insights into how better relationships and communication patterns can transform organizational dysfunction. Today, she's going to share with us how organizations can scale more effectively by focusing on what she calls interactional leadership and resilience, as well as anti-fragility. Today, she's going to share with us how organizations can scale more effectively by focusing on what she calls interactional leadership and resilience and anti-fragility. Welcome to the podcast, Jodi.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here.
So let's dive in really quickly and help our listeners understand what your journey was to becoming interested in studying resilience in the workplace.
What it comes down to, as is for most of us, you have a personal experience that then spurs you on to want to learn about something or become passionate about something. And then I took my personal experiences and started applying them into the workplace. And of course, my personal story, the very, very short version, is the first 15 years of my career, I was a nonprofit executive and I helped raise money and distribute money to organizations in need. Then my life was turned upside down. I had the diagnosis of a brain tumor wrapping around my brainstem. That changed everything about my life, as well as every relationship and every aspect of my functionality. I was forced to learn resilience. 3 brain surgeries, and now I'm 24 surgeries in. 24
Wow.
surgeries, and it's still happening. The brain tumor was 15 years ago, but the effects left me with a paralyzed face, hearing loss in my right ear, a spinal fluid leak, an infection in my brain, migraines, dizzy spells, vertigo, all of the imbalance, all of these different issues, which forced me personally to have to figure out how to do life in a different way. And I started studying about resilience to learn how I could become more resilient, and then started applying the principles I learned to my business. It actually created a change in my business. And I still do passion projects in the nonprofit world, but I left that as a career and I started writing books and speaking to teach others the principles that I learned. And my favorite principle that I learned in the study of resilience is actually something that's relatively new. The term was coined in 2012 by Nassim Taleb, and it's called anti-fragility. And what would you think of when you think of something that is fragile? What do you do with something that is fragile?
You protect it because it's easy to break, right? It breaks
Right.
easily.
So you bubble wrap it and you
Yep.
hope and pray that by the time UVS delivers it, that it arrives in one piece.
Yes.
Anti-fragile is more than the opposite of that. It's not just being strong enough not to break. It's actually the ability to get stronger and better because of mistakes and volatility, because of the errors that you've made, because of the weaknesses that you have, that you learn, you grow, you strengthen, and become better overall because of the messiness of the world. And when I heard that term, I was like, oh my gosh, this is my life. This
Mhm.
is what I need. So I consumed all of the literature. I started reading all of his books. He's also created the term the Black Swan event, which many people are familiar with, which are those events in the world, COVID, like 9/11, things that we don't necessarily see coming, but that if we really paid attention to the world, that we might be able to see coming, but that have a massive impact on the world in a given period of time. So I started reading all of his stuff. And here's the thing, I loved it. The principles were fantastic. but they applied on a very high scale.
Mhm.
He was talking about how can economies, global economies, how can countries, how can governments, how can they be anti-fragile? And I
Mhm.
kept waiting and saying, okay, when is it going to get to me? When is this going to apply to me? How do I become anti? And he didn't really go there. He stopped at the big scale. And I just thought, okay, then I got to take the principles and I got to apply the principles of the big scale. And I've got to find a way to apply them to the scale of one. And then once I figure out how to apply it to a scale of one, then how do I apply it to a business and a scale
Mhm.
of 10, or a scale of 100 or a scale of 1,000? What does this mean on these different levels? And so in a short, long story, that was how I got totally invested in understanding about anti-fragility and how the concepts of anti-fragility can help us grow through adversity.
Yeah, and I think it's really important for us to distinguish the difference between resilience and anti-fragility, right? Because resilience is a hot topic, especially in the corporate world. Everybody is wanting to be resilient, especially after COVID. When I started looking into what is this resilience that everybody's talking about, I want to be resilient. And I remember as I looked at what do we define resilience, and it really is bouncing back to where we were prior to whatever the adverse traumatic incident was, right? And I remember thinking to myself, that's all well and good and stuff, but what if I actually bounce back to beyond, right? What if there was some growth? I looked into what if there was some growth? What does that look like? I came across post traumatic growth, right?
Post-traumatic growth,
Which,
yes,
yeah,
absolutely.
but
Which is
at this,
very similar, but trauma is defined in such
yes,
a particular way that if
exactly.
you use it based solely on the definition of trauma, then there aren't nearly as many of us who've experienced actual trauma as what we might feel like.
Exactly.
And
Yes.
anti-fragility applies in so many more areas.
Yes.
And it's funny that you mentioned that, because talking about resilience and bouncing back, because I actually wrote a magazine article for Brains magazine. And it was, I think the title was, Is Resilience Overrated?
Yeah.
Why People Shouldn't Be to Bounce Back
Exactly.
for Hardship.
Yes.
Because why in the world would you want to go through something difficult and only become as good as you were before?
Exactly.
Why would you not want to become better, stronger for the
Yeah.
experience, for surviving that hard experience?
When I stumbled upon this post traumatic growth, I felt, okay, this certainly fits some of my experiences, but the actual definition of clinical trauma is pretty narrow. So, by those standards, there's a small percentage of people that actually experience clinical trauma. However, everybody experiences multiple situations of adversity, right? So I
Yes.
remember thinking, okay, what is it that we can still grow from that? We don't have to experience some sort of clinically defined trauma to have growth, right? At least that's the hope.
Yes. Yes.
So that was when I even noticed one of your posts about anti fragility. And I was like, that's it. That's what I have been looking for. It's this anti fragility. And yes, it can absolutely benefit anybody, because we all have had adversity, correct?
Yes, that's absolutely right. And when I started studying and digging into the principles and preparing material for keynotes, and I will never forget, I gave my first keynote on anti-fragility during the days of COVID, when instead of being an in-person event, it turned into an online event. It
Mhm.
was supposedly hundreds are going to be there, to 42 people logged in online. And I was like,
Uh,
oh, yeah. So it was disappointing. And I gave this first keynote presentation on anti-fragility. And within 1 week, I had 5 different organizations book me to come and speak on anti-fragility. And that was when I realized, wow, okay, something about this
yes,
resonates with people. If greater than 10% of the people in the audience took action and said, I want
yes,
to see how to apply this to my organization, then you know that you hit on something.
yes.
So the research, some of the first research that I did, that I found out about, that was actually not the author's research, but my
Mm.
personal research, just looking into the strength of getting better after a
Mhm.
struggle. I came across a study that may seem to have to do nothing with the topic that I think applies directly.
Uh-huh.
And in 1918, there was a study done on trees and the strength of trees. So when they would cut down trees to use for lumber, they would take little slices and they would look at the rings and they would count the number of rings. And the rings determine two things. One, it helps determine the age. It also helps determine the strength of the tree based on how much water and how much light, all those sorts of things. They have this study that was done in 1918. They replicated the study 100 years later in 2018. By this point in time, the lumber industry had totally changed, and there were tree farms where you're putting the trees in the best conditions possible with the most light, with the right amount of water. And they did the study and they measured and counted the rings on the trees. And guess what they found out? The trees that were grown in ideal locations had fewer rings and less strength. They were not as strong because they were not forced to survive difficult circumstances. And the idea hit me, and I just went, oh my gosh. So much of our lives is spent trying to make life easier. And yet the reality is, it is the stressful, hard, adverse circumstances that make us grow and make us stronger.
And the irony is that much of society, maybe even in the corporate world, it views experiencing trauma or some sort of adverse experience as the person's now broken, right? There's a lot of assumptions that, oh, this person had a traumatic event, they're suffering from PTSD, right? When only it's 6% of people who actually have a traumatic. So there's 94% of the rest of the population that had, some sort of traumatic experience that don't actually have PTSD. So that leaves 94% of the population with the ability to have this post-traumatic growth or anti-fragility. Although I guess I should back up and say just because you have PTSD doesn't mean that you can't recover and also have growth, right?
Right.
But the point that I'm trying to make is that there are a lot of assumptions that as soon as somebody finds out that somebody's had some sort of traumatic or adverse experience, that they are some sort of brokenness, right? Especially,
Liability. They
yes,
switch columns. They switch them from an
yes,
asset to a liability. And that happens a lot in the disability world,
yes,
in the world of people that have challenges that are, whether they're visible or invisible. Once someone finds out that there was some kind of disability, that very same assumption is made as with trauma, which is, oh, we gotta walk carefully on eggshells around this person because they are fragile. And
yes,
this, I think, is one of the ways where the world is doing a disservice because we are bubble wrapping people like we're bubble wrapping our packages.
yep,
And that doesn't do anyone any good. We need people to experience those hardships so they can grow stronger and get better. And the reality is, someone who has faced a difficult adversity and gotten through it actually is so much more equipped to do
yes,
the things because they have had to work so hard to do the same things that other people do on a normal basis.
yes,
Normally functioning people, and I don't want to say this glibly because I don't want to put anyone down, but I was really good and effective at doing life before brain tumor and brain trauma put my life into a tornado.
yes,
And I didn't understand things like depression, hardship, disability. I could just go and do all day long. And I was effective. I was fast. In fact, sometimes I was too effective and fast. I could get a job at work and I'd be done within hours. And I'm like, okay, now what do I do? Maybe more to keep me challenged.
yes,
And then my life changed and my body changed and my brain changed. And I had to work 10 times harder to do the things I had been doing before at a normal scale, not even at an excelling scale, but at a normal scale.
yes,
Over time, I had to learn these principles. I had to learn how to get creative. I call it now outworking your weaknesses.
uh-huh,
How can you take things that Maybe you can't change, you can't turn them into a strength, but you have to find a way not to let them hold you back.
Yes.
You have to camouflage your weaknesses so that they become invisible and you can still do the job you need to do. That is a hard
Yes.
thing to do. So if you think of someone who is supposed to show up at work at 8 o'clock in the morning, you take a normal functioning person and they show up at 8 o'clock. You take someone with a disability and they have to show up at 8 o'clock.
Hmm.
They may have to get up multiple hours earlier in order to have someone come in, help bathe them, help dress them. They may have to write a special needs bus. They may have to do all of these other steps to show up at work on time.
Yes.
So there is a real set of added challenges, but that also means that person works that much harder, is creative, is willing to find those workarounds, and is willing to outwork their weakness, which makes them an asset, not a liability.
I would say, in addition to that, part of their growth is also a growth in or an added amount of empathy that they have for other people as other people experience, maybe not the exact same adverse or traumatic experience, but as other people experience trials in their own life, they have an immense more amount of empathy than they did prior to that experience.
Oh, absolutely. You nailed it. And many people who've gone through truly traumatic or disabling or simply very difficult adversities end up finding ways to give back by going and participating in support groups, help groups. Many of them become social workers, or they find ways to be able to extend that empathy so they can help others who are going through hard things. Because guess what? Now they get it.
Yes.
And I can honestly say I was a person who had sympathy before. I've always been someone who feels great emotions. And so I would always try to put myself in the shoes of what someone else was going through. But when I
Yep.
went through it for myself,
Oh, yeah.
now I know the questions to ask. I
Yep.
know how to get to the heart of the matter. And guess what? People trust me with the real answers. They don't say, "Oh, I'm fine. Things are good." They don't brush it
Yep.
off. They actually tell me because they know they can trust me,
Yes.
that I understand, and that together we can, even if it's just vent, sometimes they just need to vent.
Mhm.
Other times there's a real situation we need to work through to help them grow.
I think that it's really great that business leaders are starting to become more aware of this by offering more anti-fragility because there's been this movement and recognition that everybody experiences it, right? And it can affect how they show up at work, right? Like we said, for a long period of time, it was like, okay, what happens at home? You just need to be here at 8 o'clock and do your job and then go home at 5, right? But business leaders are starting to recognize there's just so much more to it than just that.
I think it used to be the mentality of compartmentalization. You have a home life, you have a work life, and neither of the two shall meet.
Yeah.
Never the
Yes.
two shall meet. But that's just not true. And some people are better at doing that. I'm married to an engineer. He's pretty dang good at compartmentalizing because that is the way that his brain
Uh,
works, is in little boxes and in linear ways. Most of us don't do that quite as
yeah.
easily. And we bring whatever weight that we are feeling, we bring that with us when we come into work. And one of my favorite stories that I tell while I'm speaking is of a man named Samuel Plimsoll in the 1850s in Britain. He lived near the shipping yards and he kept noticing, he would go down and he would watch these ships leave day after day. And many times those ships would not come back. And there would be talk amongst the people of what happened. Oh my gosh, it was sunk at sea. And then he started noticing not just the cost of the merchandise that was being lost, but the lives that were being lost.
Mhm.
And even though he had nothing to do with it, he set himself about figuring out what was going on. So he started doing some analyzing and started investigating. And he had worked prior to that in the coal mining industry. And he knew that some lives were not valued at the way that other lives were. He had felt that personally as a miner, and
Yeah.
how many coal miners lost their lives. And he
Yeah.
saw some of these sailors' lives were being treated in the same way. So he wanted to get to the bottom of it. So he started doing the studying. And here's what he found out. So simple, yet so complex.
Mhm.
They were loading the cargo holds of the ships according to capacity, not according to weight, which means as long as there was room, they would put
Uh-huh.
more crates in the cargo hold without taking into consideration how much those crates weighed. They were literally sinking their own ships because they were weighing them down so much. And while they would do okay for a little while in while they were at port, once they got out on rough seas and the salinity of the water changed and there was even a little bit of storm or wave, those ships would sink. So the solution was very simple, which was to acknowledge that there's a difference between
Mhm.
capacity and weight. So I relate that to businesses in anti-fragility and say, we may look at someone and look at their capacity.
Mhm.
Wow, this person has so much ability. They are a get her done person and
Mhm.
can take on assignments. And I can always count on Diana. Diana is
Uh-huh.
one of my go-to people. Jeremy, he's another one. He's one of those people that I can always go to when we need extra work done. But if we are not taking into account the weight that they are carrying in their lives, we are inadvertently sinking our own people. Because if we don't know that Jeremy's mother is
Um,
on hospice and that every day he leaves work to go be with his mom, or that Diana's child is struggling with some learning disabilities and she's spending all of her time trying to help this child. And it's a super frustrating process. Or if a spouse has lost their job and is experiencing financial difficulty, we don't know what might be going on. And if we do not, as leaders, make ourselves aware, if we don't create a culture of trust and of sharing, I
mhm.
call it sharing the weight. If we
Yes.
don't allow ourselves to share the weight of the things that are going on, we are going to be sinking our ships and we're going to be sinking our people. And so the analogy, I suggest that people have a weekly weigh in, a check in with their people. What is going on? Where are you? And where are you according to the tasks that you have to do and according to the things that our team needs to accomplish this week? And then finding ways to share the load, finding ways to spread things out. If you know that someone is going to come in and they're not going to be operating at their maximum efficiency, find other ways to help, whether it's throwing some things overboard, whether it's changing priority levels or changing deadlines, or it means that someone else helps pick up the slack right now. And then later someone picks up the slack for them. It does involve amount of vulnerability
Mhm.
and sharing, but ultimately, it creates more trust and it creates more effective teamwork because people know that they can rely on each other and help each other. And then you can assure that the ship is going to sail safely to its destination. Everyone is going to arrive and they're all going to be better for it. I love that story because
Yes.
it reminds me as a leader that I have to always be watching for weight. I have to
Mhm.
look at the weight that someone is carrying and not just look at their capacity because I don't ever want to be sinking my own people or putting more on them than they can handle.
I love that story. What would you say to business leaders who are trying to evaluate, okay, does my organization have a lack of anti-fragility? Are there signs, or would you say if you're not being intentional about it, then you just need to be?
There are signs, but you don't always see them until you look for them. There
Yeah.
are a couple of things that you can do to do a little bit of analysis. One of the things you can always do is experiment.
Mhm.
You might have a set of processes, but how do we know if those processes are actually the best, the most efficient? So tinker
Mhm.
and experiment. Give your people the opportunity to fail and hopefully fail fast and fail cheap. Take big risks at a time, but take a
Mhm.
whole bunch of small risks to see if you're really doing things in the best way and see how you can improve. That's a super easy way. But that also means you have to give your people the opportunity to fail. You can't get mad when failure happens. A factory is a great example. If you have an assembly line process and someone has an idea for how they might make it more effective, give them the chance and the time to do some tests and see if it works. And if it doesn't work, fine. You found one way that doesn't work. But oftentimes, the people who are doing it repetitively, they're the ones who know. It's not necessarily the design engineer who came up with the process who knows how it can become more effective. So part of that is that failure. It's experimenting and failing and experimenting and failing. So that's one thing you can do.
Okay.
One of the things you may not be looking for, but that you need to pay attention to is redundancy.
Mhm.
Do you have coverage? Is all of your inventory stored in one location?
Yep.
Do you have one person who holds all of the knowledge for a specific process? Do you have one way of shipping your product? What happened during COVID? What happened to the grocery store shelves during COVID?
They got emptied.
And everyone was saying, what in the world? Where's the
Huh?
toilet paper? Where are the eggs? Where are all of these staples that we're so used to? Certain shipping lines were shut down during COVID, and we had a whole bunch of cargo ships waiting that couldn't be allowed into past international seas and allowed into a country. Or we had trucks that weren't allowed to cross state borders because of COVID restrictions. So if you rely on just one method or one person or one way of doing things, that puts you at risk. And so the anti-fragility aspect of it would be create redundancy. Make sure there's always someone who knows the information, who knows the processes. Make sure you have more than one way of doing things. You have more than one facility that stores your inventory. Those are the kind of things. I know for myself as a speaker, I never want to have to break my promise and not show up when I say I'm going to show up. And yet, I have real, legitimate health issues. And those could be a deterrent. I could wake up and find myself in a medical crisis or unable to fulfill what I'm supposed to do. So I've created kind of an understudy for myself. Someone who doesn't give my same talk, but who I know I can count on that gives a complimentary message that I would give and who I coordinate with this individual. And she puts my dates as a backup, as a hold on her calendar. And I let my clients know if there's a case where I cannot show up for some emergency reason, you will have either the opportunity to have this individual or you can rebook me at a different time and I will fold our contract. For me, that's a way of implementing redundancy so that my clients know they
Yeah.
can count on me to show up or at least have some level of guarantee that they're going to get what they paid for.
Yeah, and that's brilliant. They want to create that redundancy to ensure customers continue to receive the same service or products that they have come to expect
Yeah.
despite whatever adverse reactions.
I'm so glad if you stuck with us this long. Thank you so much for wanting to learn about anti-fragility. And for anyone who wants to learn a little bit more, email me at Jodi, Jodi, at jodibrown.com, and I will send you a free mini ebook with tips on anti-fragility, that my top 10 tips of things that you can do to implement anti-fragility into your life and business.
Well, thank you so much, Jodi. This was an amazing conversation. That wraps up this episode of Scale the Chaos. A big thank you to our guests for sharing their expertise and actionable insights. If you found value in today's episode, don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with your network. Your support helps us bring more conversations like this to business leaders like you. To find out more on how you can scale your chaos, you can go to my website at www.scalethechaos.com or connect with me, Rhonda Lee, that's Lee spelled Lea, on LinkedIn. Join us in our next podcast episode for part 2 of today's conversation as we continue to tackle the challenges of organizational dysfunction and help you transform chaos into scalable success. Until then, stay focused, stay inspired, and let's scale the chaos together.